Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening here. My name is Sarah Harrison. I work for the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent Societies, and in that function, I'm also the co-chair of the Interagency Standing Committee Reference Group on Mental Health and Psychosocial Support. And today I'm going to talk to you and provide an introduction to the concept of mental health and psychosocial support, and in particular in humanitarian or emergency contexts. So what are the mental health and psychosocial needs of children? And we can break this down into two concepts, which I hope you are familiar with already. On the left-hand side, you can see that there's something called the well-being flower. And this flower has petals on it. There are 7 petals that you can see. And these petals represent a particular domain or area of well-being. And you can see that there are biological areas which relate to physical health. So if you are physically healthy in your body, you also have material domain aspects of well-being, which are in relation to your basic needs, your shelter, access to food, water, sanitation facilities, clothing, non-food items as well. You also have social aspects of well-being, which is the ability to have friends, to form relationships with your peers, family members as well, and your broader community. There are also spiritual aspects of well-being, which are very important in many humanitarian contexts around the world. And this is spirituality both in terms of a form of religion, or faith, or in terms of a value system and view. And spirituality is important, particularly around issues to do with loss or grief, issues to do with mourning periods after somebody has died, or after you've lost your house, perhaps due to a natural disaster. And also celebrations of joy. When a child is born in a family, christenings, for example, or initiation ceremonies, as well as issues related to marriage or graduation and starting and ending school, for example. There are also cultural aspects of well-being, which are related to cultural activities in society, the traditions that might be done, the jokes that are told between community members, the particular traditions, the celebration days, how celebrations are taking place, as well as spaces for cultural events such as community centres or marketplaces. There are also mental aspects of well-being which are related to cognition, which is to do with your brain and its healthy development as well. And it also includes mental health conditions and other disabilities. For example, people living with epilepsy, or children with intellectual disability, or living with an autism spectrum condition. And then finally, there are also emotional aspects of well-being. So this includes happiness, laughter and joy, but also sadness and loss, and negative thoughts, and feelings of helplessness and hopelessness as well. And you can see that all aspects of those well-being are interlinked. So when we talk about psychosocial well-being, it involves all of those 7 aspects. And it's a construct that very much depends upon the culture and the context in which the emergency has happened to a community, and the expression of well-being and what are important aspects of well-being are culturally defined by the community, and in some cases by the families within communities as well. And you can see that there is a circle on the outside in relation to safety, participation and development. And these are 3 prerequisites. So 3 areas that must be in place to enable well-being to flourish. Everybody has a sense of well-being. You can either have a negative sense of well-being in relation to sadness or loss or physical ill health. And you can also have a positive sense of well-being as well. So well-being is a construct that fluctuates, and it can fluctuate across a day and also across a period of time. Usually people that have survived an emergency or are living through an emergency context or a situation of adversity, it tends to negatively impact upon their well-being. So they end up with a more negative aspect towards their psychosocial well-being, which many agencies try to measure. This well-being flower is an adaptation from a paper written by Williamson, John and Robinson that was published in 2006. On the right-hand side, this is a graphic which I hope some of you are familiar with, as it's taken from the UNICEF community-based mental health and psychosocial support for children and families in humanitarian settings. This operational guidance came out in 2018, and you can see that it's called the socio-ecological model. And in the center of that model, you can see there is the child. And then there are three aspects around the child that actually relate quite closely to the well-being flower on the left-hand side. There is a cognitive development, there is the physical development of the child, and there is the social, spiritual, and emotional development of the child. And all of those aspects are important for a child to have a positive sense of well-being and for them to develop and have a healthy developmental pathway and a healthy childhood as well. Around that child in the green circle, you can see that there are family or caregivers. And it is imperative that children have a stable caregiver, whether that's their biological parent or not, who is there to accompany them throughout their childhood and to be able to guide and ensure that they have a healthy development and also to provide protection for them as well as their basic needs. The primary source of love and attention and caregiving comes from the family, whether that's within an emergency context or outside of an emergency context, and particularly for young children, meaning infants, so children preschool age, so usually between the years of 0 to 3 or 0 to 4 years, the family is their primary lens. It's the glasses that they wear to be able to see and access the outside world. The yellow circle represents the community. And in many humanitarian contexts, the community is a fundamental support system for a child. And you've probably heard the saying that it can take a village to raise and support a child healthily. So the community also includes community centres for the child, for example, youth clubs or after-school clubs or safe spaces or child activity spaces that you might find in camp context. It also includes non-formal education spaces as well as formal schooling, which is fundamentally important for a child's educational and cognitive development. The community aspect is often fragmented in humanitarian settings, particularly in conflict settings where we tend to see communities pulling themselves apart. And community also includes access to resources within the community for parents and caregivers in relation to the child. So, for example, it can include mother and baby groups, particularly for young mothers or new mothers who are breastfeeding, for example, and need encouragement to continue lactating to support their child. And it also includes parent-teacher associations as well around a school. Or parental or caregiver engagement around an activity space or a youth club. Similarly, it could be sports activities like a football club or a basketball club. And then the final circle is culture and society. And this is usually the broader interpretation and viewpoint of children within that particular context and society. So how childhood is viewed, how children is viewed is very context dependent. And it's often enshrined in the laws of the country. So the legal age of a child, for example, what age a person can get married, what age a person can drive a car, what age do they become legally responsible. And it also includes government policies towards children. So, for example, social security benefits, the rules around placing a child with a foster family or an alternative care arrangements. And it also includes infrastructure. So making cities child-friendly. So, for example, having areas where a child can walk and can play safely away from traffic, having designated play areas, climbing frames, for example, or play parks for children as well as the government investment in its formal education and social welfare systems as well. And then you can see that there are two circles around on the left and on the right of these concentric socio-ecological model. And this is in relation to risk factors and protective factors. So in all cases, from the family and caregiver level out to the community and out to the culture and society, all of those layers, which is a bit like unpeeling a flower, or taking the shell off an egg, or unpeeling an orange, they can be both a risk factor. So a family can be the primary source of abuse, or can be neglecting a child, or can be discriminating against a child. For example, if the child has a mental health condition and the child might be chained or kept at home and hidden from a perceived sense of shame, in which case the family might be trying to protect the child, but is actually a risk factor in that child's life. And similarly, the same for a community. You can get community stigmatization towards a child, or ostracization towards a child. For example, children that might have formerly been associated with armed groups. The family and the community may not accept that child coming back for a number of years. And similarly, those three layers can also be strong protective factors as well. And the idea is to make those layers as protective as possible for a child right the way through childhood. So from when the child is first born right the way through up until they're 18 and entering into adulthood, and to minimize the risk factors around the child, whether that's at the family level, the community level, or the culture and society and environment around the child. And it's to create equality and access to services and the support that the child needs to develop and healthily, and to have a healthy childhood. So I've talked a little bit about the term MHPSS, or mental health and psychosocial support, but what does it actually mean? So the definition that's written in the IASC Mental Health and Psychosocial Support in Emergencies Guidelines is twofold. Firstly, it's about protecting and promoting psychosocial well-being, or it's about preventing and treating mental health conditions. It is a composite term that should not be separated. So you can see that on the bottom, there is an arrow indicating a spectrum. And on the left-hand side of the spectrum, we have what's called positive psychosocial well-being. And that relates very much to the previous slide where I showed you the well-being flower and the socio-ecological model. And everybody has well-being at all stages in their life, whether it's a positive sense or a negative sense of well-being. So positive psychosocial well-being is at one end of the spectrum. As situations of adversity happen, or as emergencies erupt in a particular country, for example, a natural disaster, civil unrest, it can be a technological disaster as well, such as a chemical spill, and it can also be a full-blown conflict as well. You see that people begin to develop what we call as psychosocial problems or psychological distress. And this is in relation to the emergency that's happened. So it's usually caused by the external environment or context in which that person has been found. If this is not addressed, either through care and support at the family or the community level and at the individual level, then that child and their caregiver can go on to develop a common mental health condition. And a common mental health condition includes things like depression. It can also include things like anxiety, particularly in teenage or adolescent children as well. It can induce feelings of strong helplessness and hopelessness that can lead to what's called emotional disorders or emotional-related mental health conditions. And it also includes children and their caregivers that had these conditions before the emergency happened. So some people might have been suffering from depression or might have been suffering from anxiety even before the emergency started, for whatever reason in their life. And they may have had an interruption in their treatment and their care because of the emergency happening. So, for example, they may not be able to access services. You can also get children with common mental health conditions that are there from birth. So, for example, a child might be born with an intellectual disability, or a child might go on to develop and be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, or indeed a child might also be born with Down syndrome or have epilepsy from a very young age. If all of these conditions are not treated, or if there has been an extreme amount of trauma and distress directed towards the child and their caregiver, then they can develop what's called a severe mental health condition. And this includes things like severe depression or bipolar disorder, where it usually starts in late adolescent years, where someone can have episodes of extreme activity or mania and episodes of extreme sadness or depression. It also includes epilepsy if it's not well controlled. And it also includes issues related to psychosis and schizophrenic disorders. And crucially, in emergency settings, it can also include complex trauma-related conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, which can also happen with adolescents as well as with their caregivers. And the severe mental health conditions, again, are something that can appear from birth, but they can also be induced or caused by a particular emergency or a situation of adversity, particularly if a child has suffered from extreme neglect or abuse, whether that's sexual abuse, for example, or physical abuse. But it can also be caused, for example, by children that might be addicted to substances such as drugs or such as alcohol as well. Now, the key thing is that this is a spectrum. So children and their caregivers can move up and down this spectrum throughout their life course. And they might heal, or they might be exposed to another emergency again and slide further along towards a common mental health condition or psychological distress, and then they might recover again. So it's a spectrum. So we cannot separate mental health from psychosocial support. It's about accompanying that child, their caregiver, and their family through the situations and the conditions in which they find themselves in. There is no cut-off point or threshold where we say this child, this family, this caregiver is not my responsibility. Child protection actors have a responsibility irrespective of the child, the family that's presenting to them. And you also have children living with disabilities that can be physical disabilities, sometimes in relation to the conflict, for example, due to unexploded ordnance like landmines. And you can also have children with psychosocial disabilities, such as mentioned before, like intellectual disability. And children with disabilities, unfortunately, consistently struggle to access services, and they consistently struggle to access services provided by humanitarian actors. And the flip side of that is that humanitarian actors are not being inclusive enough to children with disabilities and their caregivers. So they are our responsibility. If we are running a children's activity space, if we are running a youth club or a mother and baby group, we need to be able to work with both the mothers and the children that have got a positive sense of psychosocial well-being, that are actually managing okay, right the way through the spectrum to children, their caregivers and their families who have also got severe mental health conditions and disabilities as well. So there is no cut-off point, and it is not possible to separate mental health and psychosocial support. It is a spectrum, and it is everyone's responsibility. You may be familiar with this pyramid. It's called the intervention pyramid. It comes from the IASC, Mental Health and Psychosocial Support in Emergency Setting Guidelines. This pyramid is in direct relation to one of the key guiding principles in the guidelines, which is in relation to multi-layered supports. And you can see here that there are 4 layers on this pyramid. And you have to imagine that the pyramid has 100% at the bottom. If you were to draw a line on the vertical axis, the y-axis. So 100% is at the bottom, and you would have 0% at the top. So at the very top of the triangle. And at the very bottom, you see that there is a wide base on the pyramid. And this wide base means that 100% of the population should have access to this. And this is the social considerations and basic services and security. This is sometimes called protection mainstreaming, or mainstreaming psychosocial well-being is often other terminology. GBV actors might know it as GBV mainstreaming. The outcomes are all the same. It is ensuring that basic services provided by any humanitarian actor or any actor in a humanitarian context ensures that the services are safe, they are socially appropriate for the community in which they're claiming to support, and they protect dignity as well. Protection actors usually measure in terms of rights, and psychosocial actors usually measure in terms of psychosocial well-being. But the approach is exactly the same. So it's about ensuring that your water, sanitation, hygiene program is safe, socially appropriate, and is protecting the dignity and well-being. It's about ensuring that your food distribution and your non-food item distribution is also safe, socially appropriate, and protecting dignity and well-being. So these activities are not commonly done by protection or MHPSS actors, but it is our responsibility to support and advocate for other sectors to ensure that their programs do not do harm and do not cause additional distress to populations that are already struggling. So 100% of an affected population requires that. The next layer up is called strengthening community and family supports. And at this layer is where a lot of child protection programming is conducted. And it's about activating social networks. So if you remember back to the well-being flower and back to the socio-ecological model, you're looking very much at the family caregiver layer and at the community layer, which we know is very important. So it's all of the culture, all the traditions, the spaces, the activity spaces, the youth clubs, the after-school clubs, the parent-teacher associations, your church groups, ability to go to the mosque or the temple, your mother and baby group spaces as well, that provide this physical space where communities can come together, where they can begin to support each other, and where they can talk through their problems. They can receive awareness sessions, they can conduct activities themselves, they can learn new skills. They can also receive additional emotional support, maybe from their peers or from another mother or from another father, for example. And it also crucially provides the opportunity for social interaction, which is so important for a healthy childhood development. About 75% of the population needs that. So in addition to having social considerations of basic services and security, families in emergencies also need to have their family unit strengthened as a family, so family systemic interventions, and you also need to have community supported, and that's critical in emergency contexts where communities tend to be very fragile. The next layer has got a very challenging name. It's called focused or person-to-person or person-to-group non-specialized supports. And this level is for people that are at risk of developing psychological distress and are at risk of developing a common mental health problem or condition, or they already have a common mental health condition, for example, depression or anxiety, and they need to receive additional treatment and support. So at this layer, it includes children with disabilities that might be pre-existing to an emergency, or, for example, children that have become physically disabled as a result of stepping on a landmine, for example, and need support in adjusting to their new life circumstances again. It includes emotional, practical, and psychological support done by community social workers and teachers, and it also includes activities like case management, so for child protection cases, whether that's children associated with armed groups, children in conflict with the law, or children in distress, children separated from their families. All of those activities that are done by social workers or caseworkers are included at that level. And it also includes basic mental health care conducted by primary health care doctors and nurses as well. At this level, you will also find support to parents or to caregivers, particularly to parents and caregivers of children with disabilities. So, for example, support groups or peer networks as well. And the important thing is that the activities at this layer are in addition to already strengthening the family unit and community, and in addition to ensuring that basic services and security are provided in a safe, dignified and appropriate manner. The very top level of the intervention pyramid is what's called specialized services, and some agencies call it clinical services. And this is mental health care, clinical care by mental health specialists. So psychiatric nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, and psychotherapists. And at this layer, you're looking very much at treatment. So treatment of people with more severe mental health conditions, and also it can involve some form of treatment for people with disability. So, for example, epilepsy or intellectual disability as well in children. So that specialized services end of this intervention pyramid would be at the right end of the spectrum, where we talked about severe mental health conditions and disabilities. And again, the positive psychosocial well-being is very much dependent upon the basic services and security. So that spectrum could also be put alongside this pyramid that you can see in front of you. Now, the challenge with this pyramid is that when we are working in emergency settings, it's not so clear-cut with these 4 dividing lines. And I will just go on to demonstrate now. So for healthcare and nutrition actors, they tend to work at these levels. This can be, for example, children with severe acute malnutrition who are in a therapeutic feeding center, for example, in drought-based emergencies or in malnutrition-based emergencies, or in emergencies where the conflict has impeded or prevented access to food or to crops. And it can also include natural disasters where an entire year's worth of crops have been damaged by the natural disaster, leading to malnutrition or drought. The mine action and community-based protection actors work at these layers. Child protection actors work at these layers. And GBV actors work at these layers. So the challenge is that all of these actors need to be able to coordinate and to work together, because you need to be able to provide support to an individual child who might be a survivor of sexual violence, so it might be related to GBV, but is also a child protection issue and also has strong mental health and psychosocial needs. Similarly, you might have a child who has stepped on a landmine that requires rehabilitation services, requires access to healthcare, requires access to a social worker to help them live with a life readjustment and to help them be reintroduced and go back into the community again. It also requires livelihood support, particularly if the child was maybe supporting the family. Again, for healthcare and nutrition actors, you can have children with severe mental health conditions such as epilepsy who require access to clinical services. And because epilepsy is often stigmatized in many communities where we work, that child might be out of school, or that child might be neglected or might be bullied at school, or might not be included in the children's activity space in the camp context. So it's also a child protection issue because the child is out of school and they're being bullied and ostracized, either by their family or by the community. So the key issue is that we need to have coordination across all the sectors, because MHPSS sits uncomfortably between all the various sectors and importantly has relevance in every single sector. And this graph also shows, this pyramid also shows that referrals need to be made for the child, for the caregivers, and for the families across its full spectrum. So from referring a family who might be struggling with food, for example, or livelihoods, referring them to see if they can receive an extra food basket or seeing if they could receive an extra NFI distribution. That's a social consideration and basic services and security. That same family might need access to meeting other families or engaging in the community, so might need to be accompanied to attend the community centre activities or to encourage the child to go back to school or the child to be involved in non-formal education or an activity space. The parents might need help in managing that child at home, particularly if the child is being disruptive or is aggressive. So providing more direct parental support and family support at the household level. Children with disabilities and their caregivers often need support at home, what we call home-based care, and that would also come under the strengthening family and community supports, particularly if we are trying to get that family back integrated into the community again. Children who are having access to the non-food item parcel, the additional food, and they might be requiring more home-based care, or parents providing advice on how they can encourage their children to go back to school or manage the aggressive child. If that child is proving particularly difficult for the parent, or the child might be particularly unhappy and might be developing more serious symptoms or more serious problems, then that child might need more dedicated support and might value being seen by a social worker. So you might have a social worker or a case manager assigned to that family, which should be on that level 3 intervention. And similarly, if that child has been exposed to extreme trauma, for example, the sexual violence example, and is not managing well, they might be having flashbacks, or they might have turned to drug or alcohol to forget what's happened to them, or they might be a child formerly associated with armed groups who became addicted to a substance, for example, amphetamine. That child will likely need some form of clinical services and formal mental health specialist support from a psychologist, a psychiatric nurse, or a psychiatrist. So the key thing is that the family and the child, similar to the spectrum on the slide before, needs to be able to be moved up and down the intervention pyramid, as we call it. And so this requires referrals and an understanding of what services are available in that particular community. If you remember the community, and then the next layer, the society layer on the socio-ecological model. As child protection actors, you need to know what's available, not just in child protection, but what's available in health, what's available in mine action, what's available in GBV-related services, in camp management, in food, in non-food items as well, because you need to be able to refer and to accompany children, caregivers and families that require support, as they require support that might be more specialized or might be more mainstreamed, such as accessing basic services and security. So remember the spectrum: positive psychosocial well-being, psychosocial problems or psychological distress, common mental health conditions, and severe mental health conditions and disabilities. And your ability to refer and support and accompany a child, a caregiver and a family along that spectrum, and also in relation to this pyramid as well. Now, what are the skills and qualities of frontline community-based mental health and psychosocial workers? The key thing is they usually have some form of formal educational or professional qualifications. For example, they can be teachers. They can also be social workers. For example, they might have a bachelor's or a master's degree in social work, and then gone on to specialize in social work in the justice system, or social work with children, or social work with survivors of sexual violence, or social work with people living with mental health conditions as well. So there's different specialisms within social work. So a professional qualification and an professional educational qualification is very important for this work. And preferably that education should be related to children. And that is because it is very important that child protection and community-based MHPSS workers have a thorough understanding of childhood development. What is healthy childhood development? What happens to a child's brain as they develop? What needs to happen to the context and the environment to stimulate healthy brain development? And this is important because you need to know when that development is not happening normally, and what additional supports might be required to support that child, the caregiver or the family. And also what a child in distress looks like, or a child that might have been exposed to extreme distress or trauma in an emergency. What does it look like? How does it affect their development, their healthy development of their brain, and also development socially as well as emotionally. So there are various professions which play a role and can be called frontline community-based mental health and psychosocial workers. All of these professions are important. So you have social workers, you have teachers, you have psychologists in some context, you have activity facilitators, you have youth group leaders, you have healthcare workers that includes your nurses, your doctors, your psychiatric nurses that might have a specialism in working with children. Your psychiatrists, again, you have psychiatrists that are child and adolescent psychiatrists that have a specialism in working with people aged under 18 years. Also, nutritionists are key. and particularly in emergency contexts, because often nutritionists and nurses are the ones that have most interaction with infant children in addition to their parents. So children in nutritional feeding centres, children suffering from acute malnutrition. And also faith leaders play a very important role, and or community leaders in community-based mental health and psychosocial work, because they are important in terms of initiation ceremonies, in the cultural ceremonies, if you remember back to the well-being flower. So, for example, celebrations, marriages, funerals, unhappy times, but also being able to accompany and to guide a community through a particular difficult period like a conflict or civil unrest. And faith and community leaders are often mentors for many youth and adolescents, in addition to teachers as well. So they play an important role as a frontline community-based MHPSS worker. And this is my final slide, and I just want to give you a small snippets, some small drops of resources and where you can learn more and you can find out more information. So on the bubble, on the bottom left, I've given 3 websites where you can find more resources. The first one is mhpss.net. It's a huge interactive network and platform with over 3,500 members that's very community driven and is available in English, French, Arabic, and Spanish, and also has many resources in multiple languages, for example, in Urdu, in Tamil, in Sinhala, in Kiswahili, as well as in Portuguese and Italian, for example, in Dari and Farsi. The second one is in relation to the Interagency Standing Committee, Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Group's webpage within the Secretariat, and also the Child Protection AOR website, which many of you are already familiar with. You can see that the publications on the top are in relation to the original guidelines, 2007. They were released. They're available in multiple languages. And we also have an assessment guide or a rapid assessment guide that includes 3 tools, which includes key informant interviews with community leaders and faith leaders and teachers, for example, how to sensitively interview people living with a mental health condition in a community, and also questions for a focus group discussion that you might wish to do with children of different ages, including focus group discussions with parents and caregivers as well. Continuing on that top row, you also have a very famous book now that's called My Hero Is You, that was released this year in March. It's particularly in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's particularly for children themselves and for families to read at home in their shelter. It's available in over 127 different languages. It's also been adapted into puppet shows, radio dramas, radio plays, in audiobooks in multiple languages. There's also an animation version, and it's available in Braille and in sign language, in multiple different sign languages as well. You will most likely be familiar with the UNICEF guidance on community-based mental health and psychosocial support in humanitarian settings. That came out in 2018, and it's where the socio-ecological model comes from. We also have a referral form and a guidance note that tells you how to do the service mapping, and an example or a template referral form for how you can refer an individual child, a family, or caregivers for additional services at whatever layer of the intervention pyramid they require those services. And it also tells you how to develop a referral network amongst agencies at country level to facilitate these referrals. The last 2 documents, the one on the Common Monitoring and Evaluation Framework, we are currently updating. We hope to have an updated version coming out in the end of this year, end of 2020. And it gives you a list of indicators and outcomes and goals and impact level indicators to help you measure your mental health and psychosocial support programs in emergency settings. So very much for program planners and for monitoring and evaluation staff within your respective organizations. And lastly, we have something called the Basic Psychosocial Skills document. Again, this was produced in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. It came out this year. But it's very much for community frontline mental health and psychosocial support workers and anybody who interacts with the community or with an affected population. So you can see that there is a wide variety of faces and professions on the front cover. So it's meant to be bridging that gap between psychological first aid and what you do if you need to support a family or a child or caregivers more long term. So in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, it started in December, January time, and it's continuing now, and we're now in September. So psychological first aid is usually a frontline, a first response, but what happens if you need to accompany somebody for longer and on a daily basis, or you are daily interacting with affected populations? So it's for police, it's for shopkeepers, it's for delivery drivers, it's for nurses, it's for community health workers, it's for border officials, it's also for teachers or youth leaders who are also navigating communities and might be active in supporting communities even during lockdown period. So it's basic psychosocial skills that goes beyond psychological first aid as well. And again, we recommend that all frontline community mental health and psychosocial support workers become familiar with that guide. And that includes your teachers, your social welfare and your education professions, but also your justice professions and also other organizations or sectors, particularly working, for example, on camp coordination and camp management, or in nutrition sector as well, for example. And this was the last slide. So I shall leave you. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope that you are able to dive in and to learn more and to follow the resources. There are many out there, but I hope that we have organized them in a more easy and intuitive way as well. Thank you very much for listening and good night.